Verra Caudle kept a physic-and-seed garden on a rented plot at the edge of the dry cattle town and raised her rows of healing herbs alone in a town that would not name the half of what she grew. And the respectable side of the little place had decided she was something unnatural for it, when the truth was that she was a widow doing the one honest thing left to her. She did not know yet that before the brown of that long drought summer was out, a near-silent man who laid stone walls and cisterns for his bread, a man she had given a packet of seed and scarcely spoken to, would put his own name beside hers against the whole town and change the shape of her life. It had begun the way the hard turns of a life so often do, with a thing she did not choose. Her husband, Daniel Caudle, had been the gardener and the seed man both, a gentle, careful fellow who loved the growing things the way some men love a fiddle, and through 5 summers he had taught her the plants and the saving of seed until she could read a garden the way some women read a face. Then a low fever settled in Daniel one cold spring and would not leave. And one gray morning he was simply gone, and Verra stood among the silent, dormant beds as though the world had not ended. She buried him on the rise above the garden, and because she could work the plot and save the seed as well as any man the country had known, she went on with the one trade her hands knew, in a town that had no other place for her. And the respectable side of the town, the side with the painted storefronts and the church and the doctor's sister at the head of it, looked at a young widow growing simples no one could name, steeping yarrow and mullein and sitting up with the sick when the doctor would not come, and decided by supper of her first month alone exactly what that made her. The word went round the way the worst words always do, quiet and certain and impossible to answer, that it was not natural. A woman who knew which leaf cured and which leaf killed, who dealt in green things in the dark and would not be sick herself, and Verra Caudle, who had done nothing she was ashamed of, became a thing the decent wives lowered their voices about and drew their skirts past on. The boardwalk. Here is the thing the town had not troubled to learn about the woman it had so much to say about. Verra was no soft girl who had drifted into a strange trade by accident. She was 27, raised on a hard hill farm by a mother who had no sons and taught her to do whatever the place wanted doing, and she had never been any good at being decorative. She had the one thing of Daniel's worth keeping. His old tin and cedar seed chest with its hinged lid and rows of little drawers and paper packets, the chest he had courted her with by opening it on a winter night and naming her every seed and what it would become. The dry rattle of the seed in the papers and the small, careful work of sorting the year's saving by lamplight was the one thing in that whole, hard, lonely spring that still felt like Daniel and like home. And none of it would matter, because the drought meant to finish what the gossip had started. No rain had come since the last of the spring, week on week of hard white sky. And the creek had gone to a thread, and the shallow town wells had turned low and brackish, and a garden with no clean water and no rain is a garden that burns. The green went out of the country row by row. The kitchen plots along the town street curled and browned and died, and the families that had laughed at the seed woman watched their own gardens fail. And Verra understood, listening to the dry wind worry the seed house door, that when the want of water turned the town mean and frightened, the first person it would look to be rid of was the lone woman it had already decided to despise. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is rescued by luck or a fortune dropping out of a clear sky, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing, with whatever hard season you have been handed, and if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then pull your chair up close and stay with me. Because Verra is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people a town is quickest to whisper about are so often the very ones with the least to be ashamed of, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul to see a person plain when the whole town has decided not to. The silent soul who would see her plain was an itinerant stonemason named Tobias Lund, the closest-mouthed fellow ever to come down that road. He went town to town laying dry stone walls and building cisterns and stock tanks, slow patient work for a man content to fit stone to stone alone in the sun a whole day. He had come west years before with a wife and lost her to the same hard country their first winter, and had not married again nor wished to, and had got so far out of the habit of company that the people he worked for took his silence for sourness, the way people do. But Tobias Lund had eyes, and what they had been telling him since he rode in to wall the town's new cistern was that the seed woman the town had decided to scorn carried herself with more plain dignity than any of the women who scorned her. He saw her work the garden from dawn to dark and walk to the store through talk that would have bowed a weaker back, never once letting the town see her flinch, as though their contempt were a kind of weather she had decided not to feel. And he understood what the dry country would not say aloud, that the doctor and his sister did not mean to fight the drought, but to use it. To call her will fouled and her plot a danger, and clear the lone widow off the ground that shamed them, when her cold deep well was the cleanest water for a mile, and her saved drought-hardy seed the only seed in that whole burning country that would still come up in a year like this one. If you've made it this far into Verra's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. It was a parched evening deep in that drought summer when the thing came to a head. The doctor came out himself, a smooth returned man named Ambrose Pell, who had been away east and come back to find a widow's simple spoken of more kindly than his pills, and he brought the look of the law with him, a paper and 2 grave men of the town council. He told her, with the gate open and whoever cared to hear it, that in a season of bad water the council could not leave an unwatched well a person might call fouled at the edge of town, and that a yardful of green no one could name was no honest garden but a danger to decent folk. They meant to condemn the well and clear the ground at the month's end. He was sorry. He was the kind of man who is always sorry. And Verra stood at the edge of the garden that was the last of the life she and Daniel had built, the seed chest just inside the seed house door, and she did not beg, because she had learned from a hard mother that begging only feeds the kind of man who comes to watch you do it, but she felt the cold go all the way through her. Tobias Lund was there. He had come up at the end of the day to fill his water barrels at the one clean well in the country, as she had let him do since he started on the cistern, and he stood off by the dry stone wall in the dusk and heard the whole of it, and something in his quiet face had gone very still and very hard. He said nothing while Pell talked. He waited until the doctor had tipped his clean hat and gone back toward his lamps in town with the 2 grave councilmen, and then he came to the gate and took off his hat and turned it in his big careful hands, and said to Verra Caudle the longest thing he had said to anyone in years. He said he knew it was not his place, but he had heard what they meant to do, and it was not right. A thing she had not done, being a woman and being alone, costing her the ground and the well and the name she had kept clean through all of it. And then he said there was one way to stop them, if she could stand the idea. The town could condemn the open well of a lone woman and call it nothing, but it could not so easily declare the well of a married couple a danger, nor put a man and his wife off a lease they kept up and paid on, and the talk that called her a Yarb-Witch had nothing left to say about a married woman raising herbs in her own garden. If she would let him marry her on paper, plain and quiet before the month was out, the doctor's whole easy reason came apart in his hands. He would take a cot in the lean to buy the seed house and ask nothing of her she did not freely give, She would keep her garden, her trade, and her own self entire. And her seed, he said low, almost to himself, would be the only seed this country could plant come a year like the next one looked to be. He made the whole speech to the brim of his hat, because he could not have made it any other way. Verra did not answer that night. She lay awake in the little house with the dry wind worrying the eaves and turned it over. But she understood what he had truly offered, which was not himself, but her own good name and her own livelihood handed back to her, the very things the town and the doctor had set out to take, and he had offered it without once making her feel small, without the pity that was worse than the whispering, as a plain matter of justice and not charity. In the gray morning she went out and drew a bucket of the cold, sweet water and looked down the rows of herbs still holding green where every other garden in the country had burned, and when Tobias came up for the day's work she told him, steady, that she would take his name through the season and be grateful, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on him she would learn. Was very nearly a smile. They were married 4 days later by the country circuit preacher in the dooryard by the garden, with old Silas Boone and his wife Maud for witnesses and the dry wind off the hills for music. There was no ring and no kiss, because that was not what this was. Tobias said the words low, looking at the wellhead. And Verra said hers looking out at the brown country, waiting on a rain that would not come. That evening Verra slept in her own little house, a married woman, and Tobias slept on the lean to cot a married man, the tin-seed chest on its shelf in the dark, and neither of them yet knew what they had begun. The hard turn of that drought, summer into a thin brown autumn, was the slow making of them. The country stayed dry and short of every green thing, and there was nowhere much to be but at the work of keeping the mother plants alive for their seed. And though Tobias kept faithfully to the lean-to and asked her for nothing, a paper marriage has a way of leaking into the daylight whether two people will or no. He laid up a low dry stone wall to break the killing wind off her beds where no one had asked him to, sank a stone-lined catch basin to hold what little water there was, and carried water to the mother plants in the heat, all without a word. And she saw all of it, saw that the silent man did for her in the only language he had, the language of fitted stone and tended things, and began, without quite deciding to do for him in return, kept a plate warm for whatever hour he came down from the walls, and learned the sound of his step in the dooryard. And the talk, between two people who had married to stop talk, came slow and then easier, the way ground warms when the sun comes round to it. She found he was not silent, because he had nothing to say, but because he had spent years with no one worth saying it to, and if she went on with the garden and did not press him, the words came on their own, low at the edge of the lamplight, dry and once in a while very nearly funny. He told her a piece at a time about the wife he had lost and the house of good stone he had meant to build her and never did, and Verra did not try to fix any of it, only let him set it down where another soul could see it. But the hard, lonely plot had stopped being a place she merely endured, and they both felt the change and were afraid of it. Because a thing built to last one season has no business taking root. It was the old tin-seed chest that opened the way through. One still warm night, with the garden gone quiet in the dark, Verra took the chest down to sort the year's saving, the way Daniel had taught her, and worked the little drawers free to clean the dust from the bottom of the cabinet. And this time, when she pressed the worn cedar boards beneath the lowest drawer, the false bottom Daniel had built into it lifted under her fingers, and beneath it she found a square of paper gone soft and brown at the creases, her own name on the front in his careful hand. It was the unsteady hand of his last sick spring, and Verra understood that he had written it knowing the fever might not let him go, and hidden it in the one thing he knew she would keep, and one day take apart to clean, and never said a word. She sat down at the kitchen table in the warm lamplight and read it. Daniel had written that the great fear of his dying was not the dying, but the worry that his good, strong girl would take keeping the garden and guarding his memory for the whole of what was left her, and would spend her life shut up with the green things and her chin up and her heart closed, asking nothing of anybody because she had been taught too young to do without. The seed will keep and the garden will keep you busy, he had written, but a row of beans cannot put its arms around you, and I did not love you only to leave you a trade. And then, at the very last, in a line that must have cost the sick man the final of his strength, do not let your pride or their hard words keep you from being loved when the time comes. When a good soul sees the whole of you and does not look away, let him. That is the one thing I want for you still. Now I cannot give it to you, myself. Live, Verra, be warm. She wept then, the way she had not let herself weep since the cold morning she lost him, alone at the table with her husband's last kindness open under the lamp. Daniel had not spent his dying breath asking her to guard his memory. He had spent it begging her to set the weight down and let herself be held. The next morning, when Tobias came down, brushing the stone grit off his hands, and she handed him his coffee, she let her hand rest against his on the warm tin cup a moment longer than she ever had, and did not pull away. And he looked down at her hand, and then up at her face, and did not say one word, and everything was said. Then the worst of the dry year bore down on the country, and with it the reckoning Verra had been bracing for, though it did not come the way she had feared. The drought broke at last into a hard, short autumn, and the whole town came to the same cold understanding in 1 week that not a kitchen garden in the country had made seed worth saving through the burn, that the brackish wells had soured past drinking, and that there was not a packet of sound seed nor a bucket of clean water for next year's planting in all that dry country, save in one despised plot at the edge of town. Verra read it before any of them, her saved drought-hardy seed and her one deep cold well the single thread the whole town's next year now hung upon. She had nursed her mother plants through the burning summer with everything Daniel taught her, watering them by the cupful from the catch basin and saving the seed of only the hardiest that had stood the drought. And now the people came, quiet and shamed, to the Yarb-Witch's gate for sound seed and clean water and a steeped cure for the dry weather sickness going round. And Verra, who did not have it in her to turn a frightened soul away, gave to every one of them. And the town lived on the seed woman's garden through the worst of that year, and Tobias was with her in it. When the want came on, he had gone up and down the dry town without being asked, mending the stone of the soured wells and lining a new catch basin at the church to hold the first rain whenever it came. And when the people began to come to her gate, he stood near and said little and let the town see plain whose water and whose seed were keeping it alive, and did not need to say more. So when the month's end came on, and Ambrose Pell rode out to finish the business, the council's paper in his hand, meaning to call the well fouled and condemn the ground now the season had turned mean. He found he had walked into the wrong town. He had been too proud to come to her gate himself for seed or water. He did not know the whole town had. He stood at the gate and began on the notice in his smooth, sorry voice, and before he was well started the people began to come. Up the road from every quarter of the dry town, the families who had drawn their seed and their water and their sick bed, cures from this plot, and knew now exactly whose hands had carried them. And they made it immovably plain that the doctor was condemning no well and putting nobody off any ground. And Tobias Lund had a thing of his own to say. He came and stood at the gate beside her, and told the doctor in more words than the town had ever heard him string together, that there was not a household in the whole country that would have sound seed to plant or clean water to drink this year, but for this well and this woman's hands. and there was no honest reason left to call the water fouled or put off the only soul who had kept the town alive. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. The people simply stood for their own, and the doctor who had come to condemn a lone widow's well and clear the ground that shamed him found himself answered instead. The town he had failed crowded at her back, a whole street of plain witnesses between him and the woman he had come to unseat. Ambrose Pell tried once or twice at the smooth words that had always served him, found there was no room left at that gate for them, and rode back to town. The council found it had no wish to condemn the one clean well that had watered the place through the drought, and the notice was burned, and Verra Caudle kept her garden and her well. Tobias Lund had stood at the back of that crowd with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he crossed the dusty yard to stand at Vera's side where the whole town could see him do it, the first time he had ever put himself plainly beside her before anyone. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said low, but not so low that the nearest could not hear, that he had told her in the summer he would set her free in the fall, and had found he was a liar, because he had no wish on this earth to be free of her, and that if she would have him for true, he would count it the great good fortune of his life. And Verra Caudle, who had made her peace with quiet Rose and being of use to people who would not say her name, looked at the silent man who had seen the whole of her and never once looked away, heard her husband's last letter in her own ears, and did not make him ask her twice. They were married again in the late autumn, for true this time, when the first slow rains had come at last and gone soft into the cracked ground, and the seed papers ranged full along the seed house shelves with the best saving in 5 years. They stood up together in the little country church that had drawn its skirts past her only a season before, with old Silas and Maud Boone and half the town crowded into the back, and a few of the respectable wives near the front, looking a shade ashamed of themselves, as well they might. The circuit preacher said the words right at last, the autumn light coming gold through the glass. And that bright morning, when the work was done and the garden lay quiet and damp in the new wet, Verra took up the old tin-seed chest out of long habit and breathed the cedar of it once, soft, and let a few of the year's best seeds run dry through her fingers, just for herself, the small, homely rattle that had been Daniel's and been hers through every season, because the worn tin thing that had been the one sound of home through every lonely month had earned its place at that wedding as much as anyone in the room. She had come to the country a gardener's wife and been left a widow with a strange trade and a stolen name, certain the best of her life lay buried on the rise above the garden with Daniel. She grew old on that plot, which became a known seed garden when the seasons turned kind again, beside the quiet man who put his name beside hers when no one else would. And in time the rented plot gave way to long good beds of her own behind a fine dry stone wall he built her stone by stone, and the wives who had once drawn their skirts past her brought their failed packets to her door each spring, and were glad of her. The old tin-seed chest stood on its shelf in the seed house by then, worn smoother than ever, beside a newer one the trade had brought. And on the last evening of this story the two of them caught the low gold light through the door, the old worn one and the new. A name, it turns out, is the smallest part of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a town can do is decide who you are before it has troubled to know you. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend, before the lamp burns low. When the world has hung a name on you that you did not earn, do you let your pride and their hard words keep you small and alone? Or do you trust the right soul to see the whole of you in the hard season and stand beside you in the kind one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.